Just before we get started, I do want to say that this video is sponsored by World of Warships. It's the thinking man's action game. More on that in a bit, but if you want to get started now, make sure you check out the link to the game in the description below and use the code READYFORBATTLE2020 and you'll get tons of extra bonuses. Good times. Let's get into it. It's one of the biggest buildings in the entire world, standing at 84 meters high, housing 7,000 rooms, and with a total floor space of 450,000 square meters. Romania's Palace of the Parliament is a veritable monster. Towering over the capital, Bucharest, everything about it screams madness. Its cubic volume is 7 times that of the Palace of Versailles. Its bomb-proof lower floors stretch nearly 100 meters underground. So much stone was used in its construction that it's been compared to the Great Pyramid at Giza. But while the pyramids today inspire feelings of awe, the Parliament Palace inspires something else, at least once you know its story. A story of greed, fear, and megalomania, the likes of which the world has rarely seen. Commissioned by the communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, the palace was built at a time when Romania was suffering serious economic hardship. Intended to be a symphony to the glories of socialism, it instead became the headstone beneath which the regime was buried in a blood-soaked revolution. An icon of both craftsmanship and unbelievable vanity, this is the story of the Palace of the Parliament, Romania's communist behemoth. And I'll just add here that I've actually been to this building, I've taken a tour around it. It is incredible. If you are in Romania, I mean, incredible in its scope. Obviously, we're going to get into the history, but if you're in Romania, absolutely take the tour. Well worth it. Unlike most buildings, the Parliament Palace began not with some architect sat over a drawing board, but with a tragedy. At 9 p.m. on March the 4th, 1977, the mother of all earthquakes hit Romania. Registering 7.3 on the Richter scale, it shook streets for a full minute, bringing apartment blocks crashing down. An estimated 1,500 people died across the country. In Bucharest, the historic core was damaged almost beyond recognition. But crumbling buildings and dead locals were the last thing on Nicolae Ceausescu's minds that evening. He was too busy trying to decide what to have for dinner. At the moment the quake struck, Romania's communist leader was nearly 5,000 kilometers away in Lagos, where Nigeria's military ruler was throwing a banquet in his honor. By now, Ceausescu had been dictator for 13 years, having taken over when his mentor died in 1965. It had been a roller coaster decade plus for his fellow Romanians. When Ceausescu initially took power, he had been seen as a liberalizing force, someone who might put a brake on all the craziness that communism brought to the table. At first, he had delivered. Under Ceausescu's watch, Romania had distanced itself from Moscow, gently easing up on all the repression. Bucharest even had joined the global condemnation of the 1968 Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, a move which earned Romania friends in the West. But then 1971 had rolled around and everything changed. That year, Ceausescu had traveled to North Korea to meet the dictator Kim Il-sung. Hard as it may be to imagine now, North Korea in the early 70s wasn't an impoverished, nuclear-armed hellhole, but actually a stable economy pretty much on par with South Korea. And Kim used that stability to throw his Romanian guest the welcome party of a lifetime. As Ceausescu traveled through Pyongyang's gleaming streets, his motorcade route had been lined with thousands of North Koreans performing synchronized dances. The footage has to be seen to be believed. It looks like Kim has turned the entire city into a toy music box just for Ceausescu's pleasure. To say the Romanian dictator was impressed would be a little like saying bears enjoy a spot of alfresco defecation. Ceausescu returned home determined to build a European North Korea. The first thing he did was roll back all of his previous reforms and replace them with Kim-style repression. The dreaded secret police, the Securitate, were given new and expanded powers for torture and murder, and a budget so high it's estimated that they had a quarter of Bucharest on their payroll. At the same time, Ceausescu initiated a personality cult modeled after what had seen in Asia. Huge portraits of him and his wife, Eleanor, were erected across cities. The dictator began calling himself the genius of the Carpathians. Now, 6 years later, the genius of the Carpathians was just starting dinner when word arrived that Bucharest had been leveled by a quake. Ceausescu boarded a plane back to Romania that very night. Initially, he thought the entire capital was gone, but it soon became clear that only the historic center had been damaged. Still, the image of a completely flattened city seems to have lodged in Ceausescu's mind, the vision of a blank slate wiped clean and ready to draw on. Just as Kim Il-sung had rebuilt Pyongyang from the ashes of the Korean War, so Ceausescu now had a chance to rebuild his own socialist utopia. It was the start of a journey that would soon drag Romania to depths of suffering its population had rarely known. The first days after the quake, Ceausescu played the role of head of state, visiting the affected areas and ordering the search for survivors to continue. But the idea of a European Pyongyang hadn't gone away. Not long after, a competition was announced to redesign the damaged city. It came in two distinct phases. The first was a socialist overhaul of Bucharest center, but the second was something entirely unexpected, a new focal point for the city. Ceausescu called it the House of the People, a building capable of holding the entire apparatus of Romania's communist government. We know of it today as the Palace of the Parliament. Although all design elements were open in the competition, there was just one stipulation, aside from all the usual guff about glorifying the motherland. The new building had to be big. So big it would impact the entire city and everyone living there. Perhaps the person who would impact the most was Anca Petrescu. A 28-year-old graduate of the Ion Mincu Institute of Architecture, Petrescu was a junior assistant at the State Design Institute when the two architecture competitions were launched. Although she desperately wanted to enter, her youth made her hold back, sure that she'd make a fool of herself. She held back as the competition's first year passed, and then the second year. She held back as the government pulled down the damaged buildings in Bucharest center as plans were drawn up for more and more clearances. She held back even as the 1980s dawned and Ceausescu rejected design after design. Finally, in 1981, Anca Petrescu seems to have thought, well, to hell with this. If all the best architects had already been rejected, why couldn't she at least give it a try? That same year, she submitted an entry. By now, Romania had suffered a whole decade of Ceausescu's Kim Il-sung Tribute Act. The only television show allowed was a nightly report basically called Even More Footage of Our Glorious Leader Being Awesome. The only paintings that got made showed him and his wife, Elena, looking communist and super creepy. Given such a steady drumbeat of propaganda, you might expect Anca Petrescu to have been a little overwhelmed when she finally met Ceausescu during the competition's judging. Instead, it seems that Ceausescu was the one who was bowled over. While we don't know for certain what transpired between the two, we can infer a lot, especially when you hear what happened next. After judges disqualified her, Petrescu decided to fight tooth and nail. She quit her job, a ballsy move at the time when Romania's economy was tanking, and spent the next 3 months constructing a scale model of her architectural vision. That vision, by the way, was one of supreme tat. Petrescu dreamed up a building design so absurdly, pointlessly ornate that even Liberace would beg her to tone it down. It was big, white, and layered like a wedding cake. The interiors were filled with riches so over the top that only an Eastern European gangster could ever love them. The guys running the competition thought it was ludicrous. When Petrescu demanded her model be shown alongside the finalists, they were all like, "That model? No thanks. We've already got somewhere to do our poos." So Petrescu went over their heads. After weeks of cajoling his assistants, she managed to get in touch with Ceausescu himself. He gave her permission to place her model in the judging hall. When the day came to pick the winner, the Romanian dictator stalked in, went straight to Petrescu's design, and declared that it found his building. The official story is that her design was just so eye-catching, so good, that Ceausescu fell in love. The unofficial version is that the L word Ceausescu actually had in mind was lust, and it only involved Petrescu's building if building is communist slang for booty. At the age of 32, Anca Petrescu was now chief architect of the House of the People. It would be a decision that would haunt both her and her country for the rest of her life. By the time work began on what would become the Parliament Palace, Romania was in a desperately poor shape. Throughout the 1970s, Ceausescu had borrowed crazy amounts of money, hoovering up the credit the West bestowed upon Bucharest for occasionally criticizing Moscow. When the 1980s hit, the dictator suddenly decided to pay the country's pile of debt back as quickly as possible. The result was austerity before austerity was popular. Ceausescu stripped back services, lowered wages, and started exporting all Romania's homemade goods. goods. Unfortunately, that meant there was nothing left over for the domestic market, and so those communist breadlines got longer and longer. Yet even as his people starved, Ceausescu began building his opulent palace. The first phase of construction wasn't so much actual construction as it was unnecessary demolition. In the years since the 1977 quake, the state had knocked down plenty of damaged buildings, and then some not-so-damaged buildings that just happened to be in central Bucharest. Now the bulldozers were flattening perfectly good homes without warning. Families were given anywhere between 2 days and just a handful of hours to pack up their things. Anything not removed by the appointed deadline was simply destroyed. Up to 10,000 homes, 20 churches, and 7 synagogues fell before the bulldozers. An entire fifth of the city, equivalent to about 10 square kilometers, was reduced to rubble, wiping out uncountable years of history. Since this was a communist dictatorship, locals couldn't do anything to stop it. They couldn't do anything but watch in silence and smile when someone asked them how they felt. In 1984, Ceausescu laid the foundation stone for the House of the People. It was now time for Anca Petrescu to get to work. It's hard to overstate what a monumental undertaking this was. There's a reason the Palace of the Parliament has been called a project akin to the pyramids. Everything about its construction took place on a simply inhuman scale. Thanks to his brand of communist nationalism, Ceausescu decreed all the materials had to come from Romania. Over 1 million cubic meters of marble were required, so Ceausescu had 2 entire mountains leveled to provide the stone. Each of the thousands of rooms was supposed to include wood paneling and ornately carved doors, so the dictator decreed whole forests be chopped down. There were single carpets that weighed over 1.5 tons, chandeliers 9 meters across that held 1,000 light bulbs. To make this megalomaniacal dream reality, an estimated 1.5 million factory workers were reassigned to making the palace's fittings. This is in a country with an overall population of only around 20 million people. It has been said by many that Ceausescu was less a regular dictator than he was an old-style European king, lording it over his peasant subjects. It's in building the Parliament Palace that his feudal style can most clearly be seen. As rolling blackouts swept Bucharest, as childhood malnutrition increased, Ceausescu sat in luxury, picking out what style of gold leaf he wanted the walls to be panelled with. By 1989, it's estimated the building was swallowing 30% of the nation's annual budget. If that sounds crazy to you, well, trust me, you ain't seen nothing yet. And if you'd like to see something that is also truly impressive, well, let me tell you about today's sponsor, World of Warships. World of Warships really is the thinking man's action game, and it's a perfect balance of strategic gameplay. In the game, you take command of a massive naval fleet, which includes some of history's most iconic warships. And as you progress through the game, you unlock more and more of them, and all of these ships are super detailed. You can really see that tons of effort has been made into making them super accurate. But that's not where the accuracy ends. Weather effects are also a big part of the game, and they mean that you have to actually change your strategy. It's not like you're playing, you're like, oh yeah, the rain looks nice. It's like, oh, you actually have to play differently because it's raining, just like strategy would work in real life. So look, get started with World of Warships today through the link below and use the code READYFORBATTLE2020 to get a bunch of extras if you're a new player. 700 doubloons, 7 days premium time, 1 million credits, and 2 port slots with 2 premium ships, the USS Charleston and the Japanese Ishizuchi. And let's get back to today's video. The last premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, once claimed Romania resembled a horse being whipped and driven by a cruel rider. While that certainly gets at the suffering ordinary Romanians experienced, it does little to show the sheer madness of it all. A more appropriate image might be Romania as a starving horse being whipped by a cackling murder clown intent on driving it headfirst over a cliff. As the House of the People grew, so did the numbers involved building it. Tens of thousands worked around the clock in Bucharest. On a quiet day, there might be only 20,000 people on site. On a busy day, it would be far more. Those doing the building included soldiers, political prisoners, conscripts, and anyone else the regime could get away with dumping in the middle of a building site and telling them to get on with it. At one point, groups of nuns were shanghaied into weaving the enormous carpets. Aside from these menial workers, there were also 700 architects subordinate to Anca Petrescu. But even Petrescu was feeling the strain of working for a madman. Ceausescu had a terrifying habit of dropping by unannounced and making sweeping changes, meaning different rooms wound up being done done in totally different styles. In one instance, he walked into a room and complained that two ornately carved stone pillars weren't identical. Work was halted so men could go over every centimetre of the pillars with a ruler and check for imperfections. Eventually, one delicately chiseled rose was found to be 1 centimetre lower on the matching column. Both marble pillars were scrapped. Other time, Ceausescu's dictates were just plain weird. He demanded all the staircases be cut to fit his tiny feet, meaning it was almost impossible for anyone else to walk on them. Despite Bucharest being one of those cities that's unpleasantly hot in summer and unpleasantly cold in winter, he refused to have aircon installed, reasoning that it might be used in a poison gas attack. In a similarly paranoid vein, he also had a nuclear bunker built 90 meters beneath the palace, just in case. But the real extravagances took place on the surface. In the Union Hall, for example, a room so big you could comfortably stage the Super Bowl in it, 2 vast spiral staircases were built so that the dictator and his wife could make synchronized entrances. Lastly, Ceausescu ensured every room had a perfect echo. Like a European king of old, he was accustomed to getting what he wanted by clapping, and he wanted to be sure that when he clapped inside his new palace, everyone would hear. All told, it's thought over 1 million Romanians worked on the building itself, in addition to the 1.5 million factory workers who produced its fittings. Nor was work just confined to this one site. Ceausescu ordered a vast boulevard built running to the palace, deliberately ensuring it was longer than the Champs-Élysées. So, a palace bigger than Versailles and an avenue longer than the Champs-Élysées. Is anyone else getting a distinct Louis XIV vibe from all of this? Well, come 1989, the House of the People was still only 60% complete. While its outside was mostly finished, inside it was empty, a chilly marble tomb rising silently over Bucharest. That November, the first room was declared done. At a comically somber ceremony, Eleanor and Nicolae Ceausescu came in to inspect it, the first of many times they likely expected to set foot inside this behemoth. But if that's what they thought, well, Romania's first couple were wrong. After 6 years of sheer misery, their countrymen had finally had enough. Resentment had piled high in their hearts like highly combustible kindling. All it needed now was a single spark that would start an inferno. Luckily, in November 1989, that spark was just waiting to be lit. When communism fell in Eastern Europe, it did so with remarkably few casualties. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989 was an event more joyous than bloody. Likewise was the case with the singing revolutions in the Baltics and Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution. But there was one major exception. In mid-December 1989, the unrest sweeping Eastern Europe finally hit Romania. The western city of Timisoara exploded in protests. Initially, they focused on the treatment of a local priest by the authorities, but soon it ballooned into something bigger. At the time of the protests, Ceausescu was busy preparing for a state visit to Iran, so it's not known who gave the fatal order, Ceausescu himself or his wife Eleanor. But one of them clearly made the choice authorities in East Germany and Czechoslovakia had refused to make. The day after the protests broke out, December the 17th, the army moved into Timisoara. There were indiscriminate shootings, attacks on unarmed protesters. Although Timisoara was pacified, news of the killings spread across the country, dragging outrage in its wake. By December the 21st, the rebellion had reached such a scale that Ceausescu, now freshly returned from Tehran, decided to go out and personally calm the crowds in Bucharest. It would turn out to be the biggest mistake of his life. That cold day, Ceausescu stood on his balcony and started condemning the fascist agitators in Timisoara. But rather than being dutiful little communists, this time around the crowd started shouting back. Cries of Timisoara, Timisoara filled the air. You can see footage of this moment on YouTube. The moment Ceausescu realizes that these protests are different, the moment his regime starts to crumble. In the wake of Ceausescu's failed speech, tens of thousands of Romanians spilled out onto the streets of Bucharest. Maybe if Ceausescu hadn't become so obsessed with building the Parliament Palace, the residents of the capital might have hesitated. If they'd just had a little more to lose, maybe the protests wouldn't have reached the size they did. But what did Bucharest citizens have left to lose? Their entire economy had been turned into a machine for taking bread from their mouths and converting it into funds for the House of the People. No wonder they were pissed. By December the 22nd, Ceausescu had lost control of the capital. As crowds stormed the party's headquarters, he and Eleanor fled in a helicopter. But not before giving one last dreadful order. The 2019 book Snipers and Mystifiers documents the top-secret Securitate plan activated in the wake of Ceausescu's flight. It involved small terror cells using sniper rifles to randomly massacre crowds of people to create an atmosphere of chaos. Over the next 3 days, at least 800 people were killed by snipers. Bucharest became a war zone, its streets slick with blood. It was King Ceausescu's retribution against the commoners for daring to stand up to him, and it was also what sealed his fate. Not long after the killing started, the army abruptly switched sides, imprisoning the royal couple in Târgoviște. On Christmas Day, Ceausescu and his wife were dragged before a military panel and tried on live TV. It was the very definition of a kangaroo court. The trial lasted a mere hour, with no defense allowed. Still, it's hard not to cheer when you hear the verdict. That same day, the Ceausescus were dragged out into the chilly winter air, placed against a wall, and shot dead. By now, over 1,200 people had died in Romania's revolution, but with Ceausescu gone, the game was up. Securitate laid down their arms in early January 1990. Just as it had across Eastern Europe, communism had fallen in Romania. What that meant for the House of the People was anyone's guess. Given the whole overthrowing the government in a violent revolution thing, you'd think the Parliament Palace would have been the last thing on anyone's mind. But it was simply too damn big to ignore. When work ground to a halt in January 1990, everyone was kind of like, so what do we do now? In the case of Anca Petrescu, the answer was get put on trial. That year, a group of fellow architects brought a case against her for misuse of state assets. Someone even managed to get a charge of genocide attached, although comparing Petrescu to Albert Speer is a bit of a stretch. In the end, the formal charges against Petrescu were dropped, but she was still convicted in the court of public opinion. During her last months in Romania, Petrescu was spat on in the street, harassed, and even had her house set on fire. Eventually, she fled to France, where she found work designing buildings for Club Med, which sounds like the sort of ironic punishment that hell reserves for evil architects. As for the palace itself, well, what could the new government do? For 2 years, it was left empty. 2 years in which thieves looted what they could. 2 years in which Romania tried to decide what to do with this ultimate white elephant. After a pile of suggestions, including turning it into a Dracula theme park, it became clear there was only one viable option. In 1992, work resumed. The next year, branches of government started moving inside. Ceausescu had planned to have all of the levers of the communist state operate from inside his palace. Now it would house the entire post-socialist government. Come 1994, the building had been renamed the Parliament Palace, and both houses of government relocated inside. Although an international conference centre and a modern art gallery were later added, it's estimated that even now, a mere 30% of the enormous building is in use. The rest simply sits empty, a marble sepulchre housing dead socialist dreams. Still, the story stumbled on a little longer. In 2002, Anca Petrescu was invited back to Romania to add a glass cupola to her original design. That done, she ran for parliament and won a seat as a candidate for the opposition Greater Romania Party. For a moment, it really looked like it had all been forgiven. But luckily, this isn't the start of a tale of Petrescu's ascent to power. When she ran for mayor of Bucharest in 2005, she won a mere 5% of the vote. After that, she slipped into obscurity, only returning to international headlines when she was killed in a car crash in 2013. Today, the Palace of Parliament still stands in central Bucharest, only now it's been joined by another oversized eyesore. The People's Salvation Cathedral will be the largest Eastern Orthodox church in existence when it's completed, jostling the Parliament Palace for space on Bucharest's skyline. You'd think by now Romanians would be over giant monster buildings, but, well, apparently not. In the end, then, what is there to say about Ceausescu's grand project? Well, it's certainly big, we'll give him that, and it's built to last. There's every chance it'll still be dominating Bucharest, even when most Romanians have forgotten that a wannabe king named Ceausescu ever existed. But is there anything more to it? That's the question Romania still wrestles with. Did all the suffering in the name of this monster building have some value in the end? Or was it all for nothing? A half-decade of misery that ended only with a pointless building? It's not really for us to say. We'll leave the judgments to the people who had to suffer through the Ceausescu regime. But what we can say is that the Parliament Palace's story deserves to be known. It may not be a happy story or an inspiring one, but it is important, as any tale of suffering is. Hopefully, now we've done our part in making sure that the history is heard. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to check out our fantastic sponsor, World of Warships, who I'm linking to below. And thank you for watching.